sanitation services, and 3 out of 5 people use basic hand washing facilities, according to the latest JMP, the Joint Monitoring Report from UNICEF and from WHO. For those of you that might not be familiar with what I mean by safely managed, this means essentially that it goes beyond the provision of a facility or, let's say in this regard, a tap or a toilet. It speaks to ensuring that services are delivered in a way that are not harmful to people that use them, the people living in the broader environment, and also the environment itself. It was one of the major learnings from the MDGs that was facility focused. And now we are looking more at safe management and all of the corollary factors that actually make it very hard to achieve. And one of the places, especially where it's hard to achieve, is when you think about in urban spaces. In urban areas, servicing need is especially acute, given that we expect 75% of the population, 3/4 of the population, to be living in urban areas by 2050, with the bulk of urbanization expected to occur in Africa and Asia. Now, on average, urban population growth is about 2.7% per year, while we have piped water access growing at 3.1%, which doesn't seem so bad, right? But as this graphic indicates to you, there are significant disparities between different places, different countries in the world. So this is actually research produced by UNU INWE for the SDG 6 synthesis report that was printed last year, looking at our global achievements and progress in terms of SDG 6. UNU INWE used a traffic-like metaphor here to indicate that for green, meaning that people are or countries are keeping up, in the sense that the piped water coverage is meeting the needs of the growth of the population at that time. 42 countries are in this medium category, not keeping up, because their populations are growing much faster at a higher rate than their piped water coverage. You have 6 countries, though, highlighted in red, in which they are absolutely falling behind in terms of service delivery compared to the population growth. If you notice, too, 4 of these countries are in Africa. The statistics get even more dire when it comes to sanitation, when we think about urban sewage coverage. As you can see here, um, you have many countries. You have 19 countries that are fallen behind in terms of meeting the needs of the populations that are growing at a very, very quick, very rapid rate. Here you have 66 out of 120 countries that are actually providing sewers um, at a efficient and at an adequate rate. But 35 countries in the middle zone where there is the need for enhancement to meet need. Um, why is it that sanitation might be so much further behind than water? Oh, why is it that sanitation might be so much further behind than water? Um, I mean, one of the main reasons is that sanitation is considered the ugly step sibling in the water sector. This is more informally. But largely the idea is that everybody wants water, but we aren't oftentimes concerned about where the waste goes. We want the waste to get away from us as soon as possible without thinking about the consequences. In addition to that, urban sewage is very hard to provide, especially in areas that are already populated, or such as informal settlements, or what are also known as colloquially as slums. If you're talking about areas that are densely populated in terms of people, but also in terms of structures, think about trying to fit new, think about trying to dig ditches in between those homes, which sometimes they have to be 6 meters wide, the ditches, to build a conventional sewer. So unfortunately, Despite our knowledge of the need for improved water and sanitation services, despite our knowledge of knowing that there is a large return on investment, um, we aren't meeting what we need globally to actually achieve sufficient water and sanitation coverage. In large part, that's because of the amount of money needed. It's estimated that we require $7.5 trillion in water infrastructure investment in order to address the existing deficiencies. Um, this isn't only taking into account the difficulties that countries often have in terms of insufficient finances, and also your public administrations oftentimes being very weak or siloed and unable to support such services. Um, it also doesn't help that the bulk of water, global fresh water globally, actually accounts is provided to the agricultural sector, which is actually a segue that I'll use to go into the Cape Town water study, or the case study, which many of you might be familiar with. Because similar to this global average of 70% of global freshwater withdrawals being allocated to the agricultural sector, Cape Town, South Africa, also has about 70% of its water resources allocated to agriculture. This, um, for years, was never really a problem until actually just several years ago, between 2015 and 2018, when Cape Town, South Africa had a very severe drought, a 3-year drought that pushed the country and actually, sorry, Cape Town to a crisis point. Many of you, again, are familiar with the idea of day zero. Day zero meaning that the day, or it's kind of a foreboding day where the city was to run out of water. So Cape Town is at the very bottom of the African continent, but the city has a lot of, ah, sorry, one of my slides is out of order, but it's okay. Cape Town is at the bottom of the continent. And part of the reasons why it had the day zero crisis that when you look at its mean annual precipitation, it's already a very semi-arid country, especially when you think of where Cape Town is, with limited freshwater resources. Given the severity of the 3-year drought that was unexpected, and no changes in terms of water management in the run-up to the uh, drought. What happened was that you just had a situation where there wasn't sufficient water to meet the needs of your industry, your local agricultural sector, and the people that rely on basic water and sanitation on a daily basis. So Cape Town is a city of is a city of extreme wealth, but it also has a lot of poverty. South Africa itself is considered, according to the Gini coefficient, the most inequitable country globally, where you have very big extremes between the wealthy and just on the other side of the mountain, um, many residents living in informal settlements or slums. Um, Water for this area is provided traditionally by dams. So this is 4 of the 6 big dams that provide water for the area. And when I say that water traditionally is provided by dams, it's essentially 99%. It is mostly all of its water supplies. Why is this important to note? Because dam infrastructure, not only is it expensive to maintain over time and to build to begin with, but it also relies on rainfall in order to be replenished. So if we talk about earlier, as I noted, that this area to begin with already has minimal rainfall because it is semi-arid. And you throw in the complication of having a 3-year drought, um, as well as over time, increased water demand against population growth. you'll have issues like this, where eventually, as was the case in 2017, 2018, you had a very severe drought where the water in previous years would be beautiful, wonderful for recreational activities, in addition to providing the water needs for the area to everybody needing to rely on alternative water sources. In terms of demand management in this area, sorry, I should actually note. Um, Of this water, Waterscliff Dam being the main supply, along with the 5 other dams, the bulk of the water goes to agriculture, but Cape Town does receive a third of it, in addition to other towns at 10%, smaller towns in the area. So if we think again that 60% goes to the agricultural sector, there is that need to think about perhaps addressing how those allotments and efficiency can be improved. But Cape Town being a city, the, the agricultural demand was beyond its domain in order to manage. When it came to the Cape Town water crisis, the day zero crisis, what they could really only focus upon was water use within their own city. So there were assessments of current water uses of that 30% bulk, and they found that in general, the bulk of services, 70% meant residential demand, and then you had your retail industry and other municipal offices. So, given this, the city of Cape Town thought, okay, we will actually implement a two-pronged measure in order to address the day zero crisis. We will focus on reducing demand across all of these domains except in informal settlements, which already were provided only communal services to meet basic living conditions. And uh, also introducing alternative supplies of water, primarily through um, this was at a private level, it was groundwater or trying to opt for desalination options. This is a rainfall telling you about how in the last 3 years in Cape Town it had there was less precipitation than anticipated. Um, in general, this is one of those things that there was a lot of criticism from various people around the globe and also locally that the city had not prepared for this crisis. But given for like other forecasts in terms of rainfall, water planning in general is planned on a 100-year scheme, with it only anticipated to have a drought of this extreme once every 100 years. So this was unexpected because it was, in terms of government planning, they had intended for water resources to be more limited in the mid 2020s as opposed to the late 2010s. Um, so this major trouble, as you can see from this graph, was that led to that reduction in terms of your dams as well as increased residential demand. So when Cape Town thought about trying to diversify supply, they thought around the going beyond surface water, which is what dam reservoirs would be, dam to surface water, looking into having groundwater as well as reusing water. So reusing meaning that this is recycled water. It could be recycled gray water or wastewater, um, and generally used not necessarily for drinking water, given that many people are hesitant um, to drink recycled water, even though we all drink recycled water, um, as well as desalination. So this was the proposed strategy that Cape Town had in mind when they were thinking about how are we going to get over this crisis? How are we going to get past this crisis? Which is great that the city was thinking about diversifying. It is very important to diversify your water resources, but it also was very, how should I say, the response was more around firefighting as opposed to thinking about long-term planning. And when it comes to water management, especially going forward, it's important to think about how can you build resilience into your systems. And that discussion was oftentimes lacking when it came to addressing the day zero crisis. And what do I mean by resilience-based water management? So this gives you a quick evolution of water management from the 1990s to the present, where most of the world focuses on providing water in a blue water sense, where we're thinking mostly about economics and engineering. We want to supply the water. And at the end of the day, that water, regardless of what it is, whether it's storm water, whether it's drinking water that we flush down our toilets, are considered waste. And once we flush it away, it's gone. It's not really a concern of ours what happens beyond that. We don't really have major concerns about the ecosystem, for example, or the natural water cycle. Increasingly in the 1990s, as part of a global movement, there was a call for integrated water resources management, in which you still looked at water in terms of economics, but you wanted to put a value on it in order then to increase your ecosystems or nature-based approaches. Integrated water management also looked about interdisciplinary coordination between different actors and different role models that could be integral in ensuring that water resources were more sustainably managed. Over time, you had in the early 2000s, a movement then to sustainable urban design, looking at your integration of going beyond looking at water, but how does it interact with the land around it, as well as taking into consideration surface runoff, which we often call stormwater or what is rainwater. Um, runoff, when you think about it, actually, most of the time goes into drains, and then if you live by the sea, like in places like Cape Town, it actually will eventually go back to the ocean untreated. And this is a resource that can potentially be used. So that's why SUDS is taking this into account, not just for use, but also thinking about how surface runoff needs to be attended to in order to reduce erosion in different areas due to aggressive rainfall. It also takes into account infiltration of water and its connection to food, energy, and ecosystem services. What I propose in the paper that I believe Alberto will circulate with you later today when we reflect on the Cape Town's Day Zero crisis is a water-sensitive urban design approach, which builds upon Blue Water, Integrated Water Resource Management, and SUDS, in that we think more about the need to sustain rainfall, capture it, and making sure that there is various valuation of your resources. Um, so when I talk about that, like we're talking about really breaking down different resources in terms of the available water options. So here you have rainwater, stormwater, gray water, desalinated water. This is, I'm sorry for this, that white graphic, I'm not sure what that is. Groundwater, potential seawater, as well as you have new dams. You have in terms of scale, considerations if you're thinking about a site, like let's say someone's home, a local area or a region. And you have different opportunities thinking about development type, development density, climate, geology, and capacity. So what do I mean first about scale? So at a site scale, you have your house, local scale, a neighborhood, regional scale, you have a city or a town. It's important to bear in mind scale because you need to know this affects your management as well as then um, how are you going to plan for water resources in general? So who's going to own it? Who's going to manage and maintain it? What are your storage limitations? And then, of course, bearing in mind what are your design and modeling needs. In terms of resources, um, that you have for actually diversifying your water supply. We can look at different means for water demand management, water conservation, there's efficiency. We can talk about then if you're thinking about harvesting and reuse, then you need to talk about storage options, even including thinking about how that infiltration can possibly be used as a different means for, well, as a potential water resource and how can you store that. For example, when we think about conventional stormwater management, as I noted earlier, we tend to think of it as runoff that needs to, that is a potential hazard that in terms of flooding, right? So in terms of conventional engineering, we try to get rid of water as soon as possible, which is a shame because stormwater is a potential resource. It tends to be This graphic is a little extreme, saying that it's toxic, but it's enriched and full of nutrients, because that's how we tend to think of stormwater. But actually, if we were to use stormwater as the resource, it would require less treatment than wastewater or desalination. Desalination has a very high cost. But one of the problems with stormwater is that it's our ability in order to actually store it um, because when it seldom rains, but you do have extreme rainfall at certain times, we need to think then about where can you actually store this water. So you have stormwater ponds, like for example, and if you have wetlands, they actually mimic wetlands, like in local parks, etc. You can actually have managed aquifer recharge, which is your underground aquifers, and while you draw water from it, you also at the same time replenish it. Or you can even do as what would be the case here in this very um, small scale operation is that you'd actually just use it immediately. So it rains today, you use it tomorrow. Um, in terms of water quality, when you think about stormwater, like as this cartoon indicates, it can be highly contaminated. But then again, treatment is possible so that it can be to a potable standard. Um, Thinking about your resources storage, there are different means for this to bear in mind when it comes to harvesting and reuse, stormwater, groundwater, or water efficiency. For the first three, you can see that you need to think about available storage as well as emptying of it over time. For water efficiency, water demand management, water conservation. This can speak to reducing demand over time and actually all of your various functions just as a result of being more efficient. For those of you that might not be familiar, this is just an example of what is groundwater storage through managed aquifer recharge. So you can see you have your water supplies in general, some of it being treated, some of it coming from the sky, and all of it then in this way you can determine for treatment whether it's you're going to be your potable water supply that's fit for purpose uses, or if it's going to go all the way back to your confined aquifer. So in terms of different opportunities, so we had sites, we had resources, and we have opportunities. When you think about your water sensitive urban designing, you need to think about the types of developments that you're going to be addressing from your in situ, meaning like if you think of places like I had brought up earlier, like informal settlements, that oftentimes will be an in situ development, which tends to be very difficult and expensive. The ideal is your brownfield or greenfield site where you have minimal or no building. Um, there is also bearing in mind your development density, the climate, geology, and local capacity for implementation and long-term management. So when I talk about water sensitive urban design, what does that look like when we talk about a water sensitive house, for example, at a site? So in terms of your 20th century house, you might have here everybody having a pool, you have your water that comes to your home, you discharge it, and everything just actually goes away. Nothing is really saved, right? A water sensitive house, thinking about this going forward, is that from your home, from this pool, you'll use it actually for gray water reuse. Um, so, like if you want to think about perhaps using it for gardening or using it to flush a toilet, as opposed to flushing down 6 to 9 liters of clean drinking water every time we flush. You think about from precipitation, actually harvesting that rainwater so that over time you can reduce the amount of municipal water that you use. So you can see that this is a very different way of thinking about water, whereas instead, even your wastewater, is that instead of trying to discharge it and get away from you as soon as possible, we're thinking about alternative uses for it, given increasing water scarcity in the future. When I look at a place like South Africa, where you have a very semi-arid region, as well as much of the sub-Saharan continent, um, there is a need to think about how are you going to address and change things. So this graphic is based on a graphic that the University of Monash researchers had prepared called for water sensitive cities. And what they said that over time was that you have a history where people over time will develop more sensitive settlements. My fellow colleagues or my former colleagues at the University of Cape Town adapted this for a South African context because in an Australian context, they would not have really dealt with informal areas. And bearing in mind the informal areas, as well as their current situation in more formalized areas of South Africa, they said in terms of where South Africa currently sits, is that they're not even at the stage of being able to really um, in a position of saying that they're a water sensitive city. They're still in that process of trying to meet the service delivery needs of those living in informal areas, as well as still in terms of thinking about drainage, not using water as a resource. So there's a lot of scope here in terms of thinking about water security for the future, especially in a context like South Africa, is to actually think of any water, regardless of its quality, regardless of how it was used, as a resource that can potentially be reused and continually reused over time. It doesn't need to be treatment. It could be like we were saying, saving your household water and flushing it down a toilet, things like that. Um, Let me see. There was one other thing that I actually wanted to raise. For some reason, I don't see this here, but I had a slide about informal settlements showing off the housing, solid waste, water supply, and sanitation and drainage needs. Um, and I think going forward in places like South Africa and much of Africa as well as Asia, I'm going to actually just show you in my camera. It's very important to be able to not forget that when you are developing your water sensitive design, that it does need to be equitable as well, that you should not leave people behind, which is one of the great things that I liked about my former researchers' work, is that they took into account not just formal areas, which tend to be covered in textbooks, but bore in mind the needs of people that are living in let's how shall I say um, less desirable circumstances, but are still in gross need of water and sanitation, probably at greater risk of health calamities if these certain basic needs aren't provided for. So, lessons to take away: water insecurity should be addressed by rethinking how we actually manage water. We need to change our focus from looking at reservoirs as dams as our only way to provide for water by looking at the water resources that we currently have and that we currently are not utilizing as a valued resource going forward. In addition to that, we need to make sure that no one is left behind so that developments going forward focus on both informal and formal areas. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, I just want to say thank you very much first to my former colleagues, Lloyd Fisher-Jeffs and Neil Armitage, for sharing material for this presentation. I also co-authored a paper with Neil that Alberto will be disseminating to you after this presentation. Yes, I think it's time for questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting. I'm sure our students really enjoyed it. So I refer now to to the students for the summer school. It would be the perfect time for you to write down in the chat box if you have questions about Lina's presentation. Oh, and I will make available her presentation as well as the paper she shared with us in our learning platform that you're already familiar with. So please feel free to start writing your questions in the chat box.
Feel free to write the questions, and alternatively, if you're someone like myself, sometimes I need to process information. I'm more than happy if you want to reach out to me personally. My contact details are included here in the presentation, and similar probably to like Alberto's email, I'm sure.
That's really helpful too. Thank you very much for sharing. Let's just wait a bit. There's been having a bit of the delay with the chat box, so so we have the first one from Ali. It says that you could further explain the surface water is superior to the subterranean case of South Africa. It is specific to the case of South Africa, where is it general?
One more time,
Okay,
can
let me
you
see.
repeat that question? I missed part of it.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand a bit, little bit. I don't know. Yeah, he's asking like when you mentioned that the surface water is superior to the subterranean in the case in South Africa.
Well,
Uh, that is just in specific case in South
so
Africa.
I didn't say that necessarily that surface water is of better quality than groundwater. Both have their own forms of contaminants. What I had noted about the surface water was that, especially stormwater in this regard, is that though polluted, I was comparing it not to groundwater, but to wastewater and desalination options in terms of treatment. And when you think across those three, stormwater tends to be less expensive. It does not cost as much to treat it as it is for wastewater. And when I call wastewater, it means generally it's water that does include human fecal matter and urine, right? Gray water would not include human fecal matter and urine. And desalination, so that is water that is sourced from the ocean. My apologies if that was unclear.
No, thank you very much for your answer. We have another question from Hawa. I believe, I mean, they raised their hand. I don't know if they want to make a question. Okay, I guess you're.
fine.
just a few more
I
minutes.
understand too that everybody has different net connections. Can be difficult sometimes to connect. But to follow up on that previous question as we wait, um, sorry, I actually didn't think, and I can still address another point, is that you're asking whether or not the stormwater as a resource is a possibility only in South Africa, but it would be a possibility anywhere in the world where it essentially rains. So this is going to, it's not exclusive to the South African case. It is just more a matter that, as I said, when it comes to traditional engineering, we tend to think of water, especially stormwater, as drainage. And we need to get around that idea where this waste, it's not wastewater. It's not something that necessarily needs to be drained away. It can be used and it does have value, especially in cases of water insecurity.
So to the participants, is there any more questions you want to address now to our speaker?
Great.
I believe you have another question. Yeah, but I cannot read it. Yeah, it's
What is the long-term vision for SA? Well, actually, I'm glad that you bring that up because as you saw from my presentation, I talked about a vision that perhaps we as researchers or policy influencers have. And the water sensitive urban design has been embraced by a lot of government officials from national to your city planners in South Africa. Most people still are operating as business as usual. Um, it takes a big mindset change in order to adopt a vision as grand as this, because as you noted, as I even noted earlier, that things still don't change in terms of costing. It still is very expensive to meet your water infrastructure needs going forward. So until people get past the idea of meeting basic needs now, that firefighting and planning for the future, we likely are very unlikely to see changes when it comes to how places like South Africa manage their water resources. And a place like South Africa is actually very close to my heart. One of the reasons why I have a case study on it is that I actually studied and conducted my doctoral research there. So I lived there for about 8 years. And South Africa is not immune to a lot of the problems that a lot of public administration struggle with globally. You have corruption from your various political officials. You have a dearth of experienced professionals actually managing and supporting and planning these water services. And you have, in addition to that, as we noted, a growing population and that need. So not only do we need infrastructure investment, but we actually need strong investment when it comes to your capacity building, especially when we're talking about managing things in a new way. Because not all engineering courses or environmental science courses, for example, will actually cover water sensitive urban design. What they might cover will be maybe some form of nature-based planning, but you still will mostly learn conventional methods for having to apply or actually provide for water. And this is something that myself included, Yunye Inway, my former colleagues at the Future Water Institute at the University of Cape Town are campaigning for. We need a new vision.
For sure. Thank you. I guess I have another question is if you can
Specific strategies
mention
around
some
underground water
specific
management.
strategies about.
So, as in, would the person like specific things related to managed aquifer recharge? Can I kindly ask that person to email me and I can send them additional resources? Oh, yes.
I will just go down to the slide where your contact is. Yeah.
That I don't have a
And I guess the
figure
last
for.
question we have
I'm
is
sorry.
how expensive is to build a.
But I would say this. You might have a capital cost at the beginning, but think about it over time. You would save on your water, your municipal water charges.
Really specific question. And so the participants, do you have any more questions regarding the presentation? As Lina said already, she's available through email. If you go across her presentation and encounter another doubt or question, you can contact her. And of course,
Well,
the
thank you
presentation
again,
and
Alberto,
her
for
paper will be
having me
available in
here.
the
And
e-learning platform.
again, my apologies to everyone for being a bit delayed today. I, however, have enjoyed being here with you, and I look forward to hopefully hearing from some of you. Please do feel free to contact me should you want further information, for example, about managed aquifer recharge. We're more than happy to provide resources from Yunyu Inway. Yes, wonderful. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you very much
Bye-bye.
again, Lina, and we'll keep in touch. And we made available